They say a man's worth is measured by what he builds, by the honest sweat on his brow. For years, Dale believed that too. He figured loyalty was a simple transaction. Fair pay for a fair day's work. A dependable hand, a steady job, and everyone knew where they stood. Sometimes, though, the ground shifts beneath your feet, and you learn there's a whole lot more to standing tall than just showing up. That's how Dale lived. 48 years old, factory foreman at Atlas Manufacturing, a lifer. His hands, gnarled and powerful, looked like they'd spent decades wrestling with cold steel and hot presses. His face, weathered by fluorescent lights and long shifts, carried the quiet dignity of a man who worked hard and asked for little. His eyes, a shade of tired blue, saw everything, missed nothing, and always held the weight of responsibility. Always held the weight of responsibility. Every morning, that weight announced itself at 5 a.m. sharp, not with a jarring buzz, but with the quiet click of Brenda's old alarm clock. His world began in the dim pre-dawn light of that modest ranch house, built back when the suburbs were still stretching their legs, a solid, no-frills place he and Brenda had scrimped and saved to buy. He'd swing his feet to the cool linoleum, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant companion, a ghost of past heavy lifts. Brenda, his anchor, usually still slept, her breathing a soft counterpoint to the distant hum of the refrigerator. Dale would navigate the familiar path to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, watching the tired lines around his eyes sharpen then soften in the mirror. He'd make his coffee black, strong enough to strip paint, and sit at the kitchen table, listening to the house settle around him. Sarah, his 19-year-old, away at community college, a heavy cost every semester, but a cost he was proud to bear, a future he desperately wanted for her. Mark, 15, still dreaming in his bedroom, oblivious to the quiet grind that kept their roof overhead and his dreams possible. The drive to Atlas was a ritual. Same route, same potholes, same gray sky giving way to a grudging sunrise. The world outside his pickup window was a blur of identical houses, struggling businesses, and the promise of another shift. Sometimes, a flicker of dissatisfaction, a quiet sigh, would escape him as he considered the endless repetition, the feeling of being a gear in a massive machine. But then he'd clench his jaw, remind himself of Sarah's tuition, Mark's high school expenses, and the fleeting thought would vanish. When he pulled into the lot, the air already smelled of ozone, grease, and the metallic tang of ambition, or maybe just desperation. He'd nod to the early birds, a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden before stepping onto the factory floor. Atlas Manufacturing. 2 acres of concrete and steel, filled with the roar and clang of presses, the hiss of hydraulics, the rhythmic thud of assembly lines. For over 20 years, this had been his kingdom, his cage. He knew every machine, every employee, every nuance of the operation. He didn't just supervise, he felt the pulse of the place in his bones. He knew when the number 4 press was about to throw a bearing, could tell by the way the air vibrated. He could spot a tired hand from 50 feet away, or the faint tremor in a new guy's grip trying to hide his nerves. Efficiency was his mantra, production numbers his Bible. He believed if he kept the lines moving, kept the quality high, kept the crew working, then everything else would take care of itself. That was his job, plain and simple. But underneath the steady thrum of the factory and the predictable rhythm of his days, there was a different kind of hum, a low, persistent frequency of worry. The bills, always the bills. Property taxes creeping up, Sarah's tuition a constant drain, the old pickup needing new tires, the water heater on its last legs, just like his own back some mornings. He'd sit at the kitchen table at night, long after Brenda had gone to bed, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating columns of numbers that never quite added up. He saw the way Brenda sometimes hesitated in the grocery store aisle, saw the worn soles of Mark's sneakers, and a knot would tighten in his stomach, a familiar clench of fear. He was a good foreman, dependable, fair, and he brought home a decent paycheck, but decent felt like it was shrinking with every passing year, swallowed by rising costs and the endless demands of keeping a family afloat. Deep down, quieter than the factory noise, quieter even than his worry for his family, there were the things he kept buried. The fleeting notion years ago of opening his own small machine shop, crafting something with his hands from start to finish, feeling the grain of the metal, not just overseeing others. The ambition, long suppressed, to truly make a difference, not just keep the gears turning. He doubted sometimes in the dark hours if he was truly a leader or just a very experienced cog in a much larger, unforgiving machine. He saw his people as capable, needing direction, yes, but not necessarily his responsibility beyond their work hours. That was where he'd drawn the line, a mental barrier against the messy complications of other people's lives. He thought loyalty was earned by fair pay and good working conditions, not by emotional investment, not by getting tangled in their personal struggles. He was gruff because it was easier, no nonsense because it kept things moving. But beneath that hardened exterior was a profound fear of letting people down, especially his family, and he realized a growing, quiet fear of letting himself down, of not being enough. He carried the burden of his duty with dignity, but it was a heavy cloak, often hiding the quiet hope he held for a better future, a future where he could leave a mark that wasn't just another production quota met, a future where his kids wouldn't have to carry the same silent burdens. He was stubborn, yes, and slow to ask for help, always believing he had to carry every weight himself. That was just how a man operated, he thought, or at least how he operated. He'd always believed a good leader simply kept the plant running. He'd focused on efficiency and production, on ensuring the machines churned and the products shipped. His quiet empathy, that inner understanding of the struggles his crew faced, was a well-guarded secret, usually only surfacing in a silent nod after a layoff announcement or a discreet word to a shift manager about a guy going through a tough time. It was an observation, never an intervention. He kept his emotions locked tight, a habit forged over decades in a place that valued steel over sentiment. He figured that was the strength of a foreman, to be unwavering, a rock. But rocks, he was about to learn, could also crack. The crack, when it came, felt a long way off. For now, there was just the hum. The hum of the industrial fluorescent lights in his kitchen at 5 in the morning, the hum of the old refrigerator, the hum of the city stirring outside his modest ranch house built in '74. Dale always woke before the alarm, a habit forged in decades of knowing the plant wouldn't wait for him. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum, the chill seeping through his calloused soles, and head straight for the coffee pot. Strong, black, no nonsense, just like his day needed to be. Brenda, his wife, would usually be stirring by the time he was on his second cup, her sleepy voice a soft counterpoint to the clatter of his mug. Sarah, his college freshman, was usually still dreaming of textbooks or friends, and Mark, the high school sophomore, would be wrestling with his own dreams, or maybe just ignoring the world until the very last possible minute. Dale would sip his coffee, listening to the house creak around him, a silent inventory of his life. This house, these kids, Brenda, they were his world, his anchor, and his quiet, unyielding burden. Every leaky faucet, every tuition bill, every fleeting glimpse of worry in Brenda's eyes, it all settled onto his shoulders, a weight he'd grown so accustomed to, he barely noticed it anymore. By 5:30, he was backing his 10-year-old pickup out of the driveway, the engine groaning a little in the pre-dawn chill. The drive to the plant was a familiar tapestry of dim streetlights giving way to industrial sprawl. Warehouses, loading docks, chain-link fences topped with razor wire. He knew every pothole, every turn, the exact minute he'd start smelling the faint metallic tang of the factory air. The plant itself was a hulking beast of steel and concrete, spitting steam into the cold morning sky, its windows 100 vacant eyes. Inside, it was a symphony of clang and hiss, the relentless grinding rhythm of production that had been his world for 25 years. His job, foreman on the second shift, was a dance of efficiency. Keep the lines moving, keep the quality high, keep the men in line. He'd walk the floor, his heavy work boots thudding a steady beat on the concrete, his eyes scanning, assessing, correcting. A jammed feeder, a loose connection, a lagging output on Station 7. He knew the machines better than some of the men who built them. It was a good job, a steady job. It put food on the table, kept the bills paid, mostly. But there was a monotony to it, a soul-numbing repetition that slowly, imperceptibly wore down the edges of a man's spirit. The money, while steady, was always just enough to keep his head above water. Barely. Sarah's college tuition was a silent, ever-present weight, a figure scribbled on the corner of his mind's chalkboard. Mark was talking about wanting to study engineering, and Dale knew, with a dull ache in his chest, that would be even more. He paid his bills on time, meticulously, but there was never any cushion, no soft landing. Just the endless churn of income versus outflow, a constant, low-level anxiety that pulsed beneath the surface of his gruff exterior. He'd sometimes stare at the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the numbers blurring, and wonder if he was just treading water year after year until he finally went under. In the quiet hours when the plant hummed around him and the men were focused on their tasks, or at home in the dead of night, before the alarm, a different hum would start in his head. a whisper of what might have been. He once thought of so much more. Not fame or fortune, just more. A small business, maybe. Something he'd built with his own two hands, something that felt like his. He'd had ideas once, big plans that slowly calcified under the weight of responsibility, the need for a steady paycheck, the fear of failure. He saw the fire in Mark's eyes, the ambition, and a part of him would ache with a bittersweet regret. Had he settled? Had he given up too easily on that younger version of himself, the one who saw possibilities beyond the factory walls? He buried those thoughts deep, ashamed of them, feeling they were a luxury he couldn't afford. A man had responsibilities, and responsibility meant putting dreams on the shelf. The fear of letting his family down, of not providing, of failing them, was a deeper, colder fear than any buried ambition. He carried it, a constant, dull throb, a quiet promise to himself. You will not let them down. You will keep this machine running. That was his purpose, or so he thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and muggy, promising rain that never quite delivered. Dale remembered it because it was the day the sky didn't fall, but their world did. The shift had been running smooth, just the way he liked it. The rhythmic clang of machinery, the controlled chaos of men moving with purpose, a symphony of production. He was walking the floor, making a mental note about a sticky valve on line 3, when the call came over the intercom, flat and without inflection. All personnel to Assembly Bay Alpha. Immediate assembly. An immediate assembly was never good. Not with Henderson, the plant manager, making the announcement. Dale felt a prickle of unease, a familiar tightening in his gut, but he pushed it down. Probably just another efficiency lecture, he figured. He watched his men, a wave of them, shuffle towards the bay, some joking, some grumbling. Tony, who had just put a down payment on a new truck, winked at him. Old man Johnson, just 6 months from retirement, ambled slowly, rubbing his bad knee. Young Mike, fresh out of trade school, looked nervous. They were good men, hard men. Men Dale had worked with for decades, some for just a few years, but all of them depending on this place, on this hum of industry. When he stepped into Assembly Bay Alpha, the air was already thick with unspoken tension. Henderson stood on a small platform, flanked by 2 corporate suits Dale had never seen before, their faces unreadable like stone gargoyles. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound amplified, echoing slightly in the vast space. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice devoid of its usual practiced warmth, "I'm afraid I have some very difficult news." The words came out in a rush, clinical and detached, laced with corporate jargon about global market shifts and restructuring for future viability. But the translation was clear, brutal, and immediate. The plant was closing. Not in a year, not in 6 months. In 60 days, a collective gasp, a kind of choked groan, swept through the men. It wasn't a roar of anger yet, just disbelief. Shoulders slumped. Heads went into hands. Dale watched Tony's face go ashen, the color draining from it like water from a sink. Old man Johnson actually swayed, catching himself on the shoulder of the man next to him. Young Mike's eyes were wide, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't process what he'd heard. Dale felt a cold fist clench in his own stomach, but he just stood there, observing, his foreman's brain still trying to compute the next steps, the logistics. Then came the second blow, the one that truly broke them. Henderson, clearing his throat again, continued, "Furthermore, due to the unexpected nature of this decision and the significant financial outlay involved in decommissioning the plant, the company has, regrettably, had to make the difficult choice to adjust the previously agreed-upon severance packages, and Dale didn't hear the rest. He didn't need to. He saw the shift in the men's eyes. Disbelief morphed into betrayal. The shock hardened into something colder, sharper. Desperation. He saw the life drain out of them, not just the light, but the very hope that had kept them going through long shifts and endless bills. He saw fathers calculating lost college funds, husbands envisioning empty cupboards, sons wondering how to tell their wives they'd lost the house they just bought. In that moment, it wasn't just a plant closing. It was dozens of lives, dozens of families, suddenly untethered, adrift. And something inside Dale snapped. His old way of thinking, the one that said his job was just to keep the machines running, that loyalty was bought with a fair wage and good conditions, it shattered. These weren't just employees. They were his men. And the company, the faceless entity he'd dedicated his life to, had just hung them out to dry. He felt a profound, searing responsibility, a gut punch that went deeper than any personal fear. He felt it not just for himself, not just for Brenda and the kids, but for every single man in that room. He saw the panic, the desperation, and he realized with sickening clarity that he had let them believe in a system that had just proved itself a lie. The rain started sometime after midnight, a slow, mournful patter against the bedroom window. Brenda was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even, oblivious to the storm raging inside his head. He'd tried to sleep, God knows he'd tried. He'd lain there, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily, each rotation a slow count of the hours ticking away. But the faces wouldn't leave him alone. Tony's blank stare, Johnson's crumpled shoulders, Mike's wide, terrified eyes. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Brenda, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 3:17 a.m. 3:17, the hour of ghosts and quiet desperation. He poured himself a glass of water but didn't drink it, just stood by the sink, looking out at the rain-streaked darkness of his backyard. What had his life become? He had played by the rules. He had shown up every day. He had put in the hours, made the sacrifices, buried his own youthful ambitions for the stability of a steady paycheck, for the promise of a future, for the security of his family. He'd done everything he was supposed to do. And for what? For a company to tell him and all his men that they were disposable, cut loose with barely a word, their loyalty repaid with betrayal. The bitterness was like bile in his throat. All those years, believing he was a good foreman because he kept production up, because he maintained order, because he facilitated the flow of work. He thought he was leading. But what was he leading them to? A cliff edge, apparently. He thought of Mark, his son, with that restless energy, that bright spark of invention. He thought of Sarah, already navigating the complexities of college, finding her own path. He had taught them to work hard, to be dependable, to trust in the system. And now, what lesson had he inadvertently taught them today? That the system would chew you up and spit you out when it was done with you. That loyalty was a one-way street? A cold wave of self-doubt washed over him. He was supposed to be the strong one, the reliable one. But what good was his strength when the ground beneath them had vanished? He was just a foreman, a cog in a larger, broken machine. He doubted his ability to inspire, to lead, even to simply reassure. He had no answers, no solutions, just the cold, hard fact that he had watched his men's hopes die and he had been powerless to stop it. He had let them down, not because he wanted to, but because he believed in a lie. A deep, primal fear, colder than any financial worry, settled in his chest. It wasn't about his paycheck anymore. It was about their paychecks, their families. He had promised himself, silently, fiercely, that he would not let his family down. But now it wasn't just his family. It was all their families. And the weight of that responsibility, unshouldered before, was suddenly crushing, suffocating. Stared into the darkness, the rain a steady drumbeat, and felt utterly, completely lost. The machine was broken. And he, the man who believed his purpose was to keep it running, found himself staring at the wreckage, wondering if he was just another piece of junk. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and muggy, promising rain that never quite delivered. Dale remembered it because it was the day the sky didn't fall, but their world did. The shift had been running smooth, just the way he liked it. The rhythmic clang of machinery, the controlled chaos of men moving with purpose, a symphony of production. He was walking the floor, making a mental note about a sticky valve on line 3, when the call came over the intercom, flat and without inflection. All personnel to Assembly Bay Alpha. Immediate assembly. An immediate assembly was never good. Not with Henderson, the plant manager, making the announcement. Dale felt a prickle of unease, a familiar tightening in his gut, but he pushed it down. Probably just another efficiency lecture, he figured. He watched his men, a wave of them, shuffle towards the bay, some joking, some grumbling. Tony, who had just put a down payment on a new truck, winked at him. Old man Johnson, just 6 months from retirement, ambled slowly, rubbing his bad knee. Young Mike, fresh out of trade school, looked nervous. They were good men, hard men. Men Dale had worked with for decades, some for just a few years, but all of them depending on this place, on this hum of industry. When he stepped into Assembly Bay Alpha, the air was already thick with unspoken tension. Henderson stood on a small platform, flanked by 2 corporate suits Dale had never seen before, their faces unreadable like stone gargoyles. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound amplified, echoing slightly in the vast space. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice devoid of its usual practiced warmth, "I'm afraid I have some very difficult news." The words came out in a rush, clinical and detached, laced with corporate jargon about global market shifts and restructuring for future viability. But the translation was clear, brutal, and immediate. The plant was closing, not in a year, not in 6 months, in 60 days. A collective gasp, a kind of choked groan, swept through the men. It wasn't a roar of anger yet, just disbelief. Shoulders slumped. Heads went into hands. Dale watched Tony's face go ashen, the color draining from it like water from a sink. Old man Johnson actually swayed, catching himself on the shoulder of the man next to him. Young Mike's eyes were wide, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't process what he'd heard. Dale felt a cold fist clench in his own stomach, but he just stood there observing, his foreman's brain still trying to compute the next steps, the logistics. Then came the second blow, the one that truly broke them. Henderson, clearing his throat again, continued, "Furthermore, due to the unexpected nature of this decision and the significant financial outlay involved in decommissioning the plant, the company has, regrettably, had to make the difficult choice to adjust the previously agreed-upon severance packages, and Dale didn't hear the rest. He didn't need to. He saw the shift in the men's eyes. Disbelief morphed into betrayal. The shock hardened into something colder, sharper. Desperation. He saw the life drain out of them, not just the light, but the very hope that had kept them going through long shifts and endless bills. He saw fathers calculating lost college funds, husbands envisioning empty cupboards, sons wondering how to tell their wives they'd lost the house they just bought. In that moment, it wasn't just a plant closing. It was dozens of lives, dozens of families, suddenly untethered, adrift. And something inside Dale snapped. His old way of thinking, the one that said his job was just to keep the machines running, that loyalty was bought with a fair wage and good conditions, it shattered. These weren't just employees. They were his men. And the company, the faceless entity he'd dedicated his life to, had just hung them out to dry. He felt a profound, searing responsibility, a gut punch that went deeper than any personal fear. He felt it not just for himself, not just for Brenda and the kids, but for every single man in that room. He saw the panic, the desperation, and he realized with sickening clarity that he had let them believe in a system that had just proved itself a lie. The rain started sometime after midnight, a slow, mournful patter against the bedroom window. Brenda was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even, oblivious to the storm raging inside his head. He'd tried to sleep, God knows he'd tried. He'd lain there staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily, each rotation a slow count of the hours ticking away. But the faces wouldn't leave him alone. Tony's blank stare, Johnson's crumpled shoulders, Mike's wide, terrified eyes. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Brenda, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 3:17 a.m. 3:17, the hour of ghosts and quiet desperation. He poured himself a glass of water but didn't drink it, just stood by the sink, looking out at the rain-streaked darkness of his backyard. What had his life become? He had played by the rules. He had shown up every day. He had put in the hours, made the sacrifices, buried his own youthful ambitions for the stability of a steady paycheck, for the promise of a future, for the security of his family. He'd done everything he was supposed to do. And for what? For a company to tell him and all his men that they were disposable, cut loose with barely a word, their loyalty repaid with betrayal. The bitterness was like bile in his throat. All those years, believing he was a good foreman because he kept production up, because he maintained order, because he facilitated the flow of work. He thought he was leading. But what was he leading them to? A cliff edge, apparently. He thought of Mark, his son, with that restless energy, that bright spark of invention. He thought of Sarah, already navigating the complexities of college, finding her own path. He had taught them to work hard, to be dependable, to trust in the system. And now, what lesson had he inadvertently taught them today? That the system would chew you up and spit you out when it was done with you. That loyalty was a one-way street. A cold wave of self-doubt washed over him. He was supposed to be the strong one, the reliable one. But what good was his strength when the ground beneath them had vanished? He was just a foreman, a cog in a larger, broken machine. He doubted his ability to inspire, to lead, even to simply reassure. He had no answers, no solutions. Just the cold, hard fact that he had watched his men's hopes die and he had been powerless to stop it. He had let them down. Not because he wanted to, but because he believed in a lie. A deep, primal fear, colder than any financial worry, settled in his chest. It wasn't about his paycheck anymore. It was about their paychecks, their families. He had promised himself, silently, fiercely, that he would not let his family down. But now it wasn't just his family. It was all their families. And the weight of that responsibility, unshouldered before, was suddenly crushing, suffocating. He stared into the darkness, the rain a steady drumbeat, and felt utterly, completely lost. The machine was broken. And he, the man who believed his purpose was to keep it running, found himself staring at the wreckage, wondering if he was just another piece of junk. The rain kept falling, a steady, mournful rhythm against the window pane, mirroring the ache in Dale's chest. He stared into the blackness, utterly lost, a man adrift. He was a foreman, not a captain, and his ship was sinking. But somewhere in that abyssal dark, amidst the crushing weight of their collective despair, a spark flickered. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was something far more fundamental. It was a quiet, guttural refusal. He wouldn't be just a piece of junk. He wouldn't let them be just pieces of junk. He had spent a lifetime building things, repairing things, making things work. He might not know how to fix a company that had lost its soul, but he knew how to fix a broken machine, knew how to guide hands, knew how to stand firm when the current was pulling you under. The system might have chewed them up, but he'd be damned if he let it spit them out onto the street without a fight. His people. They weren't just employees anymore, they were his people. And he'd be damned if he let them face this alone. It wasn't a roar, not an epiphany under a sudden beam of light. It was quieter, deeper than that. It was the stubborn silence of a man who suddenly found his line in the sand. He didn't know how he was going to do it, didn't have a single answer. But in that moment, in the dead of the pre-dawn darkness, Dale decided he wasn't going to quit. Not on them. Not on the idea that a man's word, a man's loyalty, meant something more than the fine print in a severance package. He swung his legs out of bed, the floor cold beneath his feet, and felt a strange, unfamiliar resolve harden in his gut. The fear was still there, a cold knot, but now a harder, hotter kernel of defiance burned alongside it. The alarm shrilled at 5 a.m. just as it always did. Dale silenced it with a practiced swipe, the lingering dread of the previous day still a heavy shroud. For a moment, just a flicker, the thought of pulling the covers back over his head, calling in sick, letting someone else deal with the bitter residue of the plant's demise was overwhelmingly tempting. What was the point? The gears were grinding to a halt, the future was a blank, terrifying wall. But then the image of Frank's defeated face, of Maria's trembling hands, flashed in his mind. The quiet resolve of the previous night, born of desperation and a deep-seated sense of duty, pushed him forward. He just couldn't. He went through the motions of his morning ritual, but each step felt heavier, imbued with a new, somber significance. The coffee tasted like ashes, the toast like sawdust. Brenda, sensing the shift in him, watched him with worried eyes from across the kitchen table. He offered her a weak, almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise he wasn't about to break. He kissed her forehead, then Mark S., and gave Sarah's empty chair a wistful glance. Then he grabbed his lunch pail, his thermos, and his worn leather jacket, the weight of it suddenly feeling like armor instead of just protection from the morning chill. The drive to the plant was a blur of familiar streets under a bruised sky. Each turn of the wheel felt like an act of defiance, each mile chewed up by the tires a step into unknown territory. The plant loomed, a concrete monolith usually buzzing with latent energy, now a tomb of impending silence. He pulled into his usual spot, the faint smell of oil and metal already reaching him. The lot was sparser than usual, some hadn't bothered to show up. A knot tightened in his stomach. This was it, the moment of truth. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The air inside was thick with an unnatural quiet, punctuated by the hollow echoes of footsteps. The usual morning banter was gone, replaced by a sullen murmur, punctuated by the clang of metal against metal, an angry, hopeless sound. Dale walked the main aisle, his boots clunking on the concrete floor. He saw the slumped shoulders, the averted gazes, the hands going through the motions with no spark behind them. He saw the fear in their eyes, mirroring his own. His first instinct, the old Dale, was to bark an order, to demand efficiency, to shake them out of it. But the new Dale, the one forged in the dark night of his soul, took a different path. He stopped at Frank's station, where Frank was running a batch of small components, his movements slow, desultory. Frank didn't even look up. "Morning, Frank," Dale said, his voice rougher than he intended, but steady. Frank grunted, not meeting his eyes. "Morning, Dale." Dale watched him for a moment, saw the subtle tremor in his hands. He knew Frank's wife had just been diagnosed with something serious, that he needed those benefits more than ever. The words caught in his throat. He cleared it. "Anything I can help with here, Frank?" Frank finally looked up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "Help? No, Dale. Just trying to get through the day." "We'll get through it," Dale said, not knowing if it was true, but knowing he had to say it. He reached out not to correct Frank's technique, but to steady a piece of metal that was slightly off-kilter, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of support. He didn't ask about his family, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just stood there, side by side, for a moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shared burden. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a master plan. It was just a small, quiet offering of his presence. But as he continued his rounds, stopping at Maria's, at Eddie's, at each station, sometimes just to lean on a workbench and watch for a minute, sometimes to offer a quiet, "We'll figure it out," a tiny, almost imperceptible shift began. He wasn't just observing production, he was observing them. He was showing up not just as a foreman, but as a man who refused to abandon his post even if the battle seemed lost. It was hard. Every step was hard. But he kept taking them. The next few days blurred into a gray, monotonous grind. That flicker of connection Dale had felt, that tiny shift he'd observed. It was fragile, easily smothered by the persistent dread hanging in the air. The machine still hummed, the parts still moved down the line, but the rhythm was off. It was like watching a band play a funeral dirge, the notes all there, but the soul missing. He'd wake up before the alarm, the cold dread a physical weight on his chest. Every morning, a small voice in his head, a coward's voice, whispered, "What's the point, Dale? They're closing it down. Go back to sleep. Let someone else deal with the mess." But then he'd see the worn photos on his dresser, Brenda's warm smile, Sarah's determined eyes, Mark's goofy grin, and the coward's voice would shrink. He didn't have the luxury of giving up. Not yet. Not ever, he realized with a jolt. He went to work day after day, and the fight was there, palpable. Not a fight against each other, but a fight against the invisible enemy of hopelessness. He'd see Eddie, usually the first to crack a joke, just staring blankly at the conveyor belt. He'd hear hushed whispers about mortgages and medical bills that hadn't been covered since the benefits cuts. The plant had become a pressure cooker, and he was trying to keep the lid from blowing off. One afternoon, a younger guy, Carlos, who'd been with them barely 2 years, slammed a wrench down on his workstation, the clang echoing through the already tense silence. "What's the point, Dale? What's the damn point? They're just stringing us along, waiting for the paperwork to clear. We're ghosts already." His voice cracked, a raw edge of desperation in it. Dale walked over, the usual urge to reprimand, to talk about procedure rising in his throat. But he swallowed it down. He saw the panic in Carlos's eyes, the fear of a young father who had just bought his first house. "Carlos," he said, his voice quiet, "you stop working, you give them what they want. You give up. You telling me you're a quitter?" Carlos glared at him, fists clenched, ready to explode. "A quitter? What's this for?" "So they can ship out a few more units before they kick us to the curb. So the suits can get their bonuses while we starve." Dale didn't flinch. He just stood there, letting the anger wash over him, letting Carlos vent. He looked Carlos straight in the eye. "It's for you, Carlos. It's for Maria. It's for Frank. It's for whoever comes in here tomorrow and sees that the machine is still running. It's about doing the job right to the end. It's about walking out of here with your head held high, knowing you didn't roll over. And maybe it's about having a better reference when you walk into the next place, knowing you didn't leave a mess for the guy behind you." He picked up the wrench Carlos had thrown, carefully placed it back on the hook. "You got a family to feed. You got pride. Don't let them take that from you, too." Carlos didn't say anything, just stared at the wrench. Slowly, his shoulders slumped. He picked up another tool, not with anger, but with a weary resignation. Dale didn't offer a pat on the back, didn't give a lecture. He just nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and moved on. The air was still thick, but the immediate crisis had passed. Nights were the hardest. He'd sit at the kitchen table after Brenda and the kids were asleep, the house quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. He'd pull out the newspaper, circling job ads for anything, welding, assembly, maintenance. He'd flip through old phone books, recalling names, former colleagues, anyone who might know someone might have a lead. He wasn't just a foreman anymore. He was a job counselor, a marriage therapist, a crisis manager, and a scout for the future. He didn't know how to do any of it, but he kept trying. He was clunky, awkward, often felt like a fool, but he tried. Brenda, she saw it. She'd come out sometimes, pour him a fresh cup of coffee. "Still at it, honey?" She'd ask, her voice soft. He'd just grunt, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Somebody's gotta." "You're doing good, Dale," she'd say, and it wasn't an empty platitude. He could see it in her eyes. She believed it. And sometimes, in those dark hours, her belief was the only thing that kept him going. He was her steady rock, always had been. Now he had to be that for others, even when his own foundations felt shaky. One particularly grim Tuesday, word came down from corporate. The company was fast-tracking the sale of the plant assets, meaning an even shorter timeline for severance negotiations. The little hope that had been clinging to the edges of the crew's despair was shredded. Murmurs turned into open complaints. Some guys just walked off the line, clocking out early, daring management to do something. Dale felt a hot flush of anger. They were twisting the knife. He stood in the middle of the floor, watching his crew, their faces a mixture of defeat and fury. His own stomach was churning. He wanted to walk out with them, wanted to tell the suits to go to hell. But then he saw Frank meticulously cleaning his workstation, his hands shaking slightly less than they used to, but still shaking. He saw Maria quietly putting away her tools, her eyes red, but still there. They were looking at him. He felt the weight of every single one of those desperate gazes. He was their last line of defense. If he broke, they broke. He couldn't. He just could. He swallowed his anger, forced himself to breathe. He walked over to the nearest group of men who were openly discussing walking out. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, low but firm. "You want to walk out? Go ahead. They'll replace you with temps who don't know a thing about this place, and they'll screw up your severance." Or he paused, letting it sink in. "Or you finish the day. You do your job, and you come to my office after your shift." He looked around, meeting each man's eye. "Anyone who wants to talk about their options, about finding another job, about whatever it takes to get to the next step, you come see me. I ain't got all the answers, but I'll sure as hell help you look for M." It wasn't a promise of salvation. It was just a promise of persistence. And in that moment, for some of them, it was enough. A few of the men grumbled, but slowly, hesitantly, they started drifting back to their stations. The plant didn't burst into cheers, didn't rally with renewed vigor. It just kept moving one difficult, uncertain step at a time. And Dale, he kept walking among them, a silent sentinel, refusing to be moved, even when the ground beneath him felt like it was crumbling. He was there, and that was the battle. Not a fight he was winning, but a fight he simply refused to lose. The days that followed were a grind. Dale's office, a cramped space tucked beside the assembly line, became less about production reports and more about whispered anxieties. At first, only a trickle of men came, mostly the younger guys with fresh mortgages or the older ones whose pensions wouldn't stretch far enough. They sat across from him, shoulders slumped, looking like they were waiting for a death sentence. Dale didn't have a magic wand. He wasn't a human resources department, and he sure as hell wasn't a recruitment agency. But he had a phone book full of contacts, a stubborn streak wider than the main plant door, and a memory for every single man's skill set. He started small. Calls to old buddies at other factories, some still running, some teetering. He spent his lunch breaks hunched over a laptop, eyes straining at job boards, cross-referencing skills he knew his crew had with postings that seemed even remotely close. He didn't get many callbacks. Most times, the person on the other end of the line just sighed, said they were cutting back too, or wished him good luck. But Dale kept dialing. He kept searching. He printed out listings, sometimes just a dozen words on a crumpled piece of paper, and handed them to the men who came to see him, offering no grand promises, just a quiet, "Might be worth a look." The first sign that something was shifting came from old Manelli, a welder whose hands were as gnarled as ancient oak roots. Manelli had been with the company for 35 years, believed in its name like it was scripture. He'd scoffed at Dale's efforts at first, said it was a waste of time, that no one would hire a man his age. But Dale had found a small machine shop, 20 miles out, looking for an experienced hand. He'd even made the initial call himself, talked up Manelli's precision and work ethic. A week later, Manelli walked into Dale's office, not slumped, but standing straighter than Dale had seen him in months. "Got the job, Dale?" He mumbled, his voice thick, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Start next Monday. Thanks." It wasn't a roar of triumph, but a quiet, steady drip of hope, and it began to spread. Word travels fast in a factory. Manelli's success wasn't just his own. It was a crack in the wall of despair for everyone. Suddenly, Dale's office had a line. Men who'd once dismissed him now waited patiently, their initial skepticism replaced by a flicker of curiosity, then a spark of genuine possibility. Dale didn't just point them to jobs, he helped them polish their resumes, teaching them how to talk about transferable skills, instead of just, "I did what I was told." He called in favors, put in good words, became a relentless advocate for his crew. He even started a small, unofficial job board on the breakroom bulletin, scrawling new leads in his precise foreman's handwriting. He wasn't just a foreman anymore, he was a lifeline. He was the guy who stayed an hour late every day, the guy whose coffee was always cold because he was too busy making phone calls, the guy who still walked the floor, not just looking at the machines, but at the men running them, seeing them not as units of production, but as fathers, husbands, brothers, each with a family depending on them. He was still Dale, the gruff foreman, but his eyes held a new kind of intensity, a deeper understanding. He saw their fears, yes, but he also saw their quiet strength, their untapped resilience. And in doing so, he started to see his own. He pushed back against management harder than he ever had. When the company tried to nickel and dime on severance, Dale was in HR's office, papers in hand, citing clauses, arguing precedents. He made himself a nuisance, a thorn in their side, reminding them of the human cost of their corporate decisions. He was risking his own future, his own slim chance at a decent exit package, but that didn't matter anymore. His loyalty wasn't to the corporation that was folding. It was to the faces he saw every day, the men whose trust he had, perhaps unknowingly, just begun to earn. The plant was still closing, that much was inevitable. But the silence that had once been heavy with dread now hummed with a different energy. It was a shared resolve, a defiant hum of men who, though facing an end, were also quietly, bravely building new beginnings. Dale wasn't alone in his fight anymore. The men were still working their stations, still pushing production, but now they did it with a quiet pride, a sense of shared purpose. They knew Dale was fighting for them, not just with words, but with action, with his time, with his own standing. And that, more than any promise of a new paycheck, was building a loyalty stronger than steel. The whispers began to change. From anxious murmurs about what would be lost, they shifted to determined talks about what could be built. Dale, once an island, now found himself at the center of a bustling network. He wasn't just fighting HR anymore. He was a one-man employment agency. His phone, which used to ring only for production problems, now hummed with calls from other plant managers, from contractors, from his own dwindling contacts in the industry. He was doing informational interviews in his tiny office after hours, sometimes through lunch. He was teaching guys how to format a resume, how to talk about their skills without sounding like they were begging. He even had Brenda, bless her heart, helping out proofreading applications late into the night. The men started to reciprocate. Billy, the old-timer who barely spoke a word, showed up one morning with a list of contacts for a smaller fabrication shop across town. Maria from assembly started organizing carpools for interviews. The plant itself, usually a place of individual effort, began to operate like a true team, not just on the line, but in the break room in the parking lot. They were sharing leads, practicing interview questions, lending each other ties for job appointments. Dale saw it, felt it. Weight on his shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it was being shared, distributed amongst the dozens of men he had once only seen as employees. A warmth, unfamiliar and deeply reassuring, started to spread through his chest. He looked at these men, his crew, and saw not desperation, but dignity. Weeks later, the plant was a ghost of its former self. Machines stood silent, covered in plastic like sleeping giants. The last production run was long finished, but Dale was still there. And so were a dozen of his men. They were cleaning, packing, organizing. Not because they had to, not because they were getting paid for it. Most of them had already started new jobs at other places, some even at competing plants Dale had helped them secure. They were there because they wanted to be. Because Dale was there. He was still Dale, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, the calluses on his hands a little tougher from all the extra work. But the gruffness had softened, replaced by a quiet authority, a comfortable ease. He walked the empty floor, the echoes of machinery replaced by the creak of his work boots, and felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Not in what they had built, but in how they had handled the demolition. He'd helped get nearly 80% of his crew placed before the final shutdown. He'd even wrangled a slightly better severance package for the long-term guys after weeks of dogged negotiation. His own job was gone, his future uncertain, but he felt richer than he ever had. One afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow, he watched old Frank, who'd been with the company longer than Dale had been alive, carefully loading his toolbox onto his pickup. Frank paused, looked back at the empty factory, then turned to Dale. "Thanks, Dale," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "for everything." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Dale just nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. He knew, everyone knew. He hadn't just secured them jobs, he had salvaged their dignity, their sense of worth in a world that often forgot it. He had shown them that even when the house was burning down, someone was still fighting for them, not for the timbers or the roof, but for the people inside. Later that evening, sitting on his porch, Brenda beside him, the scent of honeysuckle thick in the air, Dale looked at his calloused hands. They looked the same, but the man behind them felt different. The fear of letting people down was still there, a whisper, but it was overshadowed by the quiet satisfaction of having not let them down. He realized that for years he'd believed leadership was about keeping the production line moving, about schedules and quotas. He'd thought loyalty was bought with a good wage and steady hours. He'd been wrong, terribly, profoundly wrong. "Brenda," he said, his voice quiet, "I used to think my job was just to make sure those machines ran. To keep the numbers up, that if the paycheck was fair, that was enough. But when everything went sideways, when those men looked at me, really looked at me, I saw it. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about their kids' college funds, their mortgages, their sense of what they were worth. He paused, looking out at the fading light. Turns out you can pay a man for his time. You can't pay him to trust you. To really trust you, to know you'll stand by him when the whole damn world is pulling the rug out from under him. That kind of loyalty, you gotta earn it day in and day out, especially when there ain't no paycheck coming. That's when you really earn it. And so it was. A man who thought he knew what leadership was found out it was something entirely different. Something forged not in